The Valorian medical frigate Gentle Current moved slowly through the debris field that floated in the darkness of space like a graveyard of metal and dreams. Commander Thessaly stood at the observation window with her silver-blue skin rippling in patterns that showed her grief, and her four eyes scanning the wreckage that stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. This had once been the colony transport Meridian Hope, and it carried 200 souls toward a new life. On a distant world, the four pirates had torn it apart and left. Nothing but twisted metal and silence. Another salvage mission, whispered her second officer Ven as he stood beside her with his own skin shifting to darker shades of sorrow. Thessaly had commanded the Gentle Current for 30 years, and she had seen too many scenes like this one because the space lanes of the galactic consilium were dangerous places where pirates hunted and killed without consequence. The 11 species of the consilium had built a civilization that spanned 1,000 worlds, but they had never found a way to stop the killing. That happened in the dark spaces between the stars. Begin standard recovery protocols, Thessaly ordered with a heavy voice as she turned away from the window because she could not bear to look at the destruction any longer. Her crew moved with practiced efficiency because they had done this work many times before, and they knew that their task was to recover what remained and document the dead and send notifications to the families who would never see their loved ones again. The scanners swept through the debris field, searching for anything that might be worth recovering, and finding only the cold signatures of death. And then something impossible happened. The medical officer, Cress, made a sound of disbelief as she stared at her console with all four of her eyes wide open in shock. "Commander," she said with a voice that trembled, "I am detecting a life sign." Thessaly spun around so fast that she nearly lost her balance. "That cannot be correct," she said as she crossed the bridge in 3 long strides to look at the console herself. "The attack happened 11 days ago, and no one survives 11 days in a debris field. But the scanner did not lie, and somewhere in that graveyard of metal, there was a heartbeat. It is very weak," Cress said as she adjusted the sensors to pinpoint the location. "But it is definitely there, and it is definitely alive." Thessaly felt something she had not felt in years, and it was hope. "Take us in," she commanded with new energy in her voice. "Launch the rescue shuttle immediately and get a medical team ready." The Gentle Current moved through the debris with careful precision as the crew worked to locate the source of that precious heartbeat. They found it in a cargo pod that had been designed to transport farming equipment and had never been meant to shelter a living being. The pod was battered and scorched with 3 ugly patches where someone had welded metal plates over hull breaches, and it tumbled slowly through the void like a forgotten toy. "There are tool marks on the exterior," reported the shuttle pilot as she maneuvered alongside the pod. "Someone repaired this from the inside." Thessaly watched on the main screen as her rescue team cut through the pod's hatch with lasers and pulled open the metal door to reveal what waited within. A human female lay curled in the corner of the pod, surrounded by empty food packets and water containers. She was small and young, with dark hair that floated around her face in the zero gravity, and skin that had gone pale from cold and hunger. Her eyes were closed, and she barely seemed to breathe, but she was alive. The medical team moved with desperate speed as they wrapped her in thermal blankets and carried her to the shuttle and rushed her back to the Gentle Current, where the medical bay was already prepared. Thessaly met them at the airlock and walked beside the stretcher as they carried the human to the treatment room. "She is severely hypothermic," Cress reported as she worked over the unconscious woman with instruments that hummed and beeped. "She's also dehydrated and malnourished and showing signs of oxygen deprivation, but she is going to survive." The human's eyes fluttered open as the warmth began to return to her body, and she looked up at the alien faces surrounding her with confusion and fear. "You are safe," Thessaly said gently as she leaned over the woman with what she hoped was a reassuring expression. "You are aboard a Valorian medical ship, and we found you in the debris field. The human's cracked lips moved, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. "The others," she said, with desperate hope in her eyes. "Did you find the others?" Thessaly felt her heart break because she knew what she had to say. "We searched the entire debris field," she said softly. "You are the only survivor, and I am sorry." The human closed her eyes and tears began to flow down her cheeks as the terrible truth sank into her mind. 200 people, she whispered. There were 200 people on that ship. Thessaly placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder because she did not know what else to do. "What is your name?" she asked. "Myra," the human said through her tears. "Myra Chun, and I was an engineer on the Meridian Hope." Over the next several hours, the medical team worked to stabilize Myra Chun while Thessaly pieced together the story of her impossible survival. The pirates had struck without warning and torn the transport apart in minutes, and Myra had been working in the cargo bay when the attack began. She had sealed herself inside a cargo pod moments before the section. She was in lost atmosphere, and she had used her engineering skills to patch the breaches and ration her supplies and wait for rescue that she had no reason to believe would ever come. 11 days alone in the dark with nothing but her determination to keep her alive. Thessaly had never seen anything like it, and she found herself feeling a new respect for this small, fragile species called humanity. When Myra was strong enough to speak again, she asked a question that confused Thessaly deeply. "Has anyone told Earth?" she asked with urgency in her voice. Thessaly did not understand why this mattered so much. "We will follow standard notification protocols," she assured the human. "The families will be informed." "No," Myra said with surprising force for someone so weak. "You need to tell Earth, and you need to tell them now, and you need to tell them everything." Thessaly did not know what difference it would make, but she honored the request because this human had earned at least that much. She sent a message to the human embassy on Consulim Station with all the details of the attack and the recovery and the single survivor. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. The Galactic Consulium had existed for 3,000 years, and in that time, it had developed protocols and procedures for every situation that could possibly occur in the vast darkness of space. The Valorians had been founding members of this great alliance of species, and Commander Thessaly knew every rule and regulation as well as she knew her own name. When a ship was attacked and destroyed, there were forms to fill out and reports to file and notifications to send in compensation. Claims to process. It was all very orderly and very civilized, and very cold. Humans had only been traveling among the stars for 80 years, and they were still considered newcomers to the galactic community. They had a small embassy on Consulim Station and a handful of colony worlds, and they were barely a footnote in the great records of interstellar civilization. Thessaly expected her message to be received and acknowledged and filed away in some bureaucratic system where it would be processed in due time, according to proper procedures. She did not expect what happened next. Reply came in 4 hours, and it did not come from the embassy. It came directly from Earth itself, from something called the United Nations Emergency Response Directorate. And it was very short. Hold position. The message said, "Fleet inbound and estimated time of arrival is 31 hours. Thessaly read the message 3 times because she was certain there had been some translation error. Fleet was a word that meant many ships, and many ships were sent to fight wars or respond to disasters of planetary scale. There had been one attack on one transport with one survivor, and that did not require a fleet. She sent a reply asking for clarification and explaining that the situation was under control, and that the survivor was being treated, and that the debris field had been cataloged according to standard protocols. No response came. She sent another message, pointing out that there was no need for military vessels, and that the gentle current was perfectly capable of handling the recovery operation. Still no response. The only thing that came from Earth was a tracking beacon that showed 17 ships. burning hard toward their position at speeds that should have been impossible. Thessaly called her senior officers to the bridge to discuss this strange development. Perhaps they misunderstood the situation, suggested Ven as he studied the tracking data with growing unease. Perhaps they think there are more survivors to rescue. I was very clear in my message. Thessaly replied, there is only one survivor, and we have already recovered her. Then why send a fleet? Asked Cress with confusion in her voice. No one had an answer. The hours passed slowly as the human ships drew closer, and Thessaly found herself growing more nervous with each passing moment. She had dealt with humans before, and they had always seemed like a reasonable species, if somewhat emotional and unpredictable. But this response made no sense to her, and things that made no sense were often dangerous. Myra Chun was recovering quickly in the medical bay, and Thessaly went to speak with her about the approaching fleet. I sent the message as you requested. She told the human who was sitting up in bed and eating her first solid meal in almost 2 weeks. But I do not understand what is happening, and there are 17 ships coming, and they will be here soon. Myra looked up from her food with an expression that Thessaly could not read. 17 ships. She repeated softly. That is a full response group. What does that mean? Thessaly asked. Myra set down her food and looked at the commander with eyes that held something deep and fierce. It means they are not just coming for me, she said. They are coming for everyone. Before Thessaly could ask what that meant, the navigation officer announced that the human fleet had arrived. The gentle current shuddered slightly as massive ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel all around them, and the main view screen filled with images that made Thessaly's breath catch in her throat. These were not diplomatic vessels or cargo haulers or medical ships like her own. These were warships, carriers bristling with fighter craft and destroyers, with weapons that gleamed in the starlight, and heavy cruisers whose hulls were scarred with the marks of past battles. And in the center of this armada was a ship unlike anything Thessaly had ever seen. It was enormous, with a hull that stretched for kilometers and covered with arrays and sensors that hummed with power, even from a distance. What is that? Whispered Ven with awe and fear mixing in his voice. That is a recovery vessel, Myra said from the doorway of the bridge where she had appeared, despite medical orders to stay in bed. We built them after the colony wars, and their purpose is to find people who've been lost. A communication request came through from the flagship, and Thessaly accepted it with trembling hands. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to a human woman with dark skin and gray hair and eyes that held the weight of many years and many battles. She wore a uniform covered in medals and insignia, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who commanded worlds. I am Admiral Okonkwo of the United Nations Recovery Fleet, she said in a voice that was calm and measured. We have come to take custody of the survivor and conduct a full investigation of this attack. I am Commander Thessaly of the Valorian medical frigate Gentle Current, Thessaly replied while trying to keep her voice steady. The survivor is stable and receiving treatment, and I'm not sure why such a large force was necessary for a simple recovery operation. Admiral Okonkwo's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. May I come aboard? She asked, in a tone that was polite but left no room for refusal. Thessaly agreed, and within the hour, a shuttle had docked with the Gentle Current, and the Admiral had come aboard with a small escort of officers. She went first to Myra Chun and took the young woman's hands in her own and held them tightly. You survived, she said with warmth that seemed out of place in such a stern woman. You held on and you survived, and we are so proud of you. Myra's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded but could not speak. Then Admiral Okonkwo turned to Thessaly and clasped her hands in the same gesture. Thank you, she said with complete sincerity. Thank you for saving her, and thank you for sending the message, and thank you for holding position until we arrived. Thessaly felt uncomfortable with such intense gratitude for what she considered a routine rescue. It was our duty, she said. We could not leave her to die. Something flickered across the Admiral's face, and it might have been surprise or approval or something else entirely. No, she agreed. You could not, and we will not forget that. She released Thessaly's hands and her expression became businesslike. Now show us where you found her. She said, we need to scan the debris field. For what? Thessaly asked with confusion. We have already catalogued everything of value. Admiral Okonkwo looked at her with those deep and ancient eyes. For the others, she said, there are no other survivors. Thessaly insisted. We scanned the entire field, and Myra-chan was the only life sign. The Admiral nodded slowly. I understand, she said, but we are not looking for survivors, and we are not looking for salvage, and we are not following your protocols. She turned and walked toward the airlock where her shuttle waited. We are bringing our people home, she said, all of them. Commander Thessaly had been a spacer for her entire adult life, and she had seen many strange things in the vast reaches between the stars. She had witnessed the birth of new suns and the death of old worlds and the endless variety of life that filled the galaxy with wonder and terror in equal measure. But she had never seen anything like what the humans did in the debris field of the Meridian. Hope, the massive recovery vessel, moved into position at the center of the wreckage and opened its cargo bays like a great beast opening its mouth. From within poured hundreds of drones that spread out through the debris in patterns so precise that they seemed almost alive. What are they doing? Asked Van as he watched the swarm of machines move through the twisted metal and shattered hull plates. A young human officer had been assigned to the Gentle Current to act as a liaison between the Valorian crew and the human fleet. His name was Lieutenant Osei, and he had dark skin like the Admiral and dark circles under his eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. They are searching, he said simply. Searching for what? Thessaly asked. We already told you, there are no survivors. Lieutenant Osei looked at her with tired eyes that held something she did not understand. Ma'am, he said, with respect but also with steel in his voice. We are not looking for survivors, and we know there are no survivors, but there are still 199 people out there in that wreckage. They are dead, Thessaly said bluntly, because she did not see the point in avoiding the truth. Yes, Osei agreed. They are dead, but that does not mean they are gone, and that does not mean they do not matter, and that does not mean we are going to leave them here to drift in the cold forever. Thessaly watched as the drones worked with incredible precision, and she began to understand what was happening. They were not just scanning for life signs or searching for valuable salvage. They were looking for everything: genetic material and personal belongings and data cores and flight recorders, and every tiny piece of evidence that could tell the story of what had happened to the Meridian. Hope, this is not a salvage operation, she said slowly as the realization dawned on her. No, ma'am, Osei said with something like pride in his voice. This is search and rescue. But there is no one left to rescue, Thessaly insisted. The young lieutenant looked at her with an expression that was patient, but also sad, as if he was trying to explain something very simple to someone who could not quite grasp it. With respect, ma'am, he said, there is always someone left, and even if we can only bring back pieces, and even if we can only bring back their story, then that is what we will do. Over the next 6 days, the human fleet worked without rest. The drones scanned every fragment of debris and cataloged every piece of wreckage and located every trace of the 200 people who had been aboard the transport. Recovery teams in armored suits ventured into the dangerous sections of twisted metal and shattered bulkheads to retrieve what the drones had found. Thessaly watched it all with growing amazement as the humans pulled body after body from the wreckage. Many of them were badly damaged by the violence of the attack or the harsh conditions of space. But the humans treated each one with the same careful reverence. They did not rush, and they did not cut corners, and they did not decide that any single person was not worth the effort. We have recovered 186, individual so far, reported Assay during one of his regular briefings. The remaining 13 were likely vaporized in the initial attack, but we are still searching. How can you identify them? Thessaly asked. Some of these remains are barely recognizable as having once been living beings. Genetic databases. Assay explained. Every human who travels in space has their genetic information on file, and we can match even a small sample to a specific individual. That seems like an enormous amount of effort for dead people, observed Venn, who did not understand human customs any better than his commander. Assay's expression hardened for just a moment before he controlled himself. They were alive when they boarded that ship, he said with quiet intensity. They had names and families and dreams, and they trusted that if something happened to them, we would not forget them. He paused and looked out the observation window at the human ships, working tirelessly in the debris field. We will never forget them, he said. While the recovery operation continued, the massive vessel also worked on analyzing the data cores and flight recorders that had been retrieved from the wreckage. Teams of analysts pieced together the final moments of the Meridian Hope, using sensor logs and communication records and the personal devices of the passengers. After 18 hours of continuous work, they had reconstructed the attack in complete detail. Admiral Okonkwo called a briefing aboard her flagship, and Commander Thessaly was invited to attend. She took a shuttle across to the carrier and was escorted to a large conference room where officers from across the fleet had gathered. Holographic displays filled the room with images of the attack and the faces of the people who had died and the ships that had killed them. The attackers were Kreth Syndicate. The Admiral announced to the assembled officers, "They operate out of a station in the Malvax Drift, and they have been conducting piracy in this region for over 40 years. Thessaly knew of the Kreth Syndicate because everyone knew of the Kreth Syndicate. They were one of dozens of pirate groups that operated in the lawless spaces between Consilium territories, and they were considered one of the most dangerous. Consilium records show that the Kreth have conducted 217 documented attacks over the past 4 decades. Admiral Okonkwo continued. They have killed thousands of beings from nearly every species in the Alliance, and they have faced no meaningful consequences for their actions. She paused and looked around the room at her officers. That changes today, she said. Thessaly felt a chill run down her spine because she understood what the Admiral was saying. You cannot be serious, she said before she could stop herself. The Consilium has procedures for dealing with piracy, and there are diplomatic channels and enforcement protocols. Admiral Okonkwo turned to look at her with those deep and ancient eyes. Your procedures have allowed this to happen 217 times, she said without anger but with absolute certainty. Your procedures allowed the Kreth to kill our people, and your procedures allowed them to continue killing for 40 years without consequence. She turned back to her officers. We will not follow your procedures, she said. We will follow ours. She brought up a navigation display showing the location of the Malvax Drift. Plot a course, she ordered. We are going to pay the Kreth Syndicate a visit. Thessaly wanted to object, but she found that she had no words. The humans were going to war, and they were going to war because someone had killed their people, and no one had done anything about it. And as she watched the fleet begin to move, she realized something that should have been obvious from the start. The humans had not sent 17 ships because they cared about one survivor. They had sent 17 ships because they cared about all 200, and they would not stop until every single one had been brought home. The messages began arriving almost immediately after the human fleet changed course. The Galactic Consilium had observers everywhere, and word traveled fast when 17 warships began moving toward a known pirate stronghold with hostile intent. First came the messages from the Consilium Council itself, expressing concern and urging restraint, and reminding the humans that there were proper channels for addressing piracy. Admiral Okonkwo read the messages and filed them without response. Then came Messages from the Valorian government asking Commander Thessaly to use her influence with the humans to prevent what they called an unauthorized military action. Thessaly had no influence with the humans, and she was not certain she would have used it even if she did. Then came messages from the Crest Syndicate themselves, broadcasting on all frequencies and warning the approaching fleet that any attack would be met with overwhelming force. The humans did not respond to those messages either. They simply kept coming. The Malvax Drift was a region of space filled with asteroid fields and debris clouds that made navigation treacherous and provided perfect cover for those who wished to hide from the law. The Creth had built their main station inside one of the largest asteroids, and they had fortified it with weapons platforms and defense shields that had repelled Consilium enforcement actions. 3 times in the past they had fighters and gunships and cruisers of their own, and they had been preparing for battle since the moment they learned the humans were coming. Commander Thessaly watched from the bridge of the gentle current as the human fleet approached the Creth stronghold. She had been invited to observe, but warned to stay well back from the combat zone. They have no idea what they are facing, said Ven as he studied the Creth defenses on the tactical display. That station has withstood attacks by combined Consilium forces, and the humans are outnumbered at least 3 to 1. Perhaps they will reconsider, suggested Cress hopefully. Admiral Okonkwo's voice came over the communication channel as she addressed the Creth one final time. This is Admiral Okonkwo of the United Nations Recovery Fleet, she said calmly. You attacked the colony transport Meridian Hope 14 days ago, and you killed 199 people, and you left 1 survivor to die alone in the cold. She paused for a moment. We have come to deliver justice for the dead, she continued, and we have come to ensure that you never harm anyone again. The Creth leader responded with laughter and threats and promises that the humans would regret their arrogance. Admiral Okonkwo ended the transmission without another word, and then the battle began. The Creth launched their fighters in waves that darkened the stars, and their cruisers moved to intercept the human fleet with weapons blazing. Thessaly expected the humans to fall back and regroup as she had seen other forces do when facing the Creth defenses, but the humans did not fall back. They charged straight into the teeth of the Creth assault, and they fought with a fury that Thessaly had never witnessed in all her years among the stars. Human fighters swarmed through the Creth formations with pilots who flew as if they did not fear death. Human destroyers absorbed punishment that should have crippled them and kept fighting with weapons that never stopped firing. Human cruisers targeted the Creth defense platforms with precision strikes that tore through shields and armor like they were made of paper, and the massive recovery vessel that had seemed like a non-combatant transformed into something terrifying as hidden weapon ports opened across its hull, and beams of light lanced out to slice Creth ships in half. The battle lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of fire and death and destruction that lit up the Malvax Drift like a second sun when it was over. The Creth Syndicate had been destroyed, not defeated or driven back or forced to negotiate. Destroyed, every ship eliminated, and every defense platform shattered, and the great station itself cracked open like an egg, with atmosphere venting into space and fires burning in the wreckage. Thessaly watched in stunned silence as the human fleet regrouped and began the grim work of ensuring that no Creth vessel had escaped. They will hunt down every survivor, said Ven with something like fear in his voice. They will not stop until every single Creth is dead. But Thessaly was watching something else on her sensors. Human shuttles were launching from the carriers and heading not toward the fleeing Creth ships, but toward the shattered station itself. What are they doing? She asked Lieutenant Osei, who had remained aboard the gentle current throughout the battle. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright with purpose. The station had holding cells, he said, prisoners from raids that the Creth never bothered to ransom or release. Thessaly felt her blood run cold. They are searching for survivors, she realized. We always search for survivors, Ose said simply over the next 3 days, the human fleet worked through the wreckage of the Kreth stronghold. They found prisoners who had been held captive for years, and they found prisoners who had been forgotten in cells that had lost power during the battle, and they found prisoners who had died only hours before rescue had arrived. There were hundreds of them from nearly every species in the Consilium. Some had been missing for decades, and their families had long ago given them up for dead. The humans loaded them onto medical ships and treated their injuries, and began the long process of identifying them and contacting their families. But that was not all they found in the deep sections of the station. They discovered something that made even the hardened human soldiers pause: mass graves. Thousands of bodies disposed of like garbage over 4 decades of piracy, victims of the Kreth who had been killed or worked to death or simply forgotten until they stopped breathing. The humans did not leave them there. They brought in more ships and more equipment, and they began the same meticulous process they had used in the debris field of the Meridian Hope. They identified every single body using genetic databases from across the Consilium. They cataloged every piece of evidence and documented every crime. They built a record of 40 years of atrocities that the galaxy had chosen to ignore. Admiral Okonkwo held a press conference that was broadcast across every inhabited world in the Consilium. The Kreth Syndicate no longer exists, she announced to the watching billions. But they were not just pirates, and they were not just raiders, and they were not just criminals. She paused, and her face showed a grief that seemed too heavy for one person to bear. They were murderers who operated for 40 years without consequence, because the galaxy decided that their victims did not matter enough to stop them. She looked directly into the camera. Every victim mattered, she said. Every single one, and we will not stop until every single one has been identified and returned to their families. Behind her, a display showed the faces of the recovered dead, scrolling past in an endless stream: humans and Valorians and Kreth victims and species from across the galaxy. All of them finally found, all of them finally coming home. 3 months had passed since the destruction of the Kreth Syndicate, and the galaxy had not stopped talking about what the humans had done. Some called them heroes, and some called them dangerous, and some called them foolish, but everyone agreed that something had changed in the way the Consilium understood its youngest spacefaring species. Commander Thessaly had been invited to Earth to attend a memorial ceremony for the victims of the Meridian Hope and all the other victims who had been recovered from the Kreth stronghold. She had never visited the human homeworld before, and she did not know what to expect. What she found was chaos and beauty in equal measure. Earth was a world of oceans and mountains and cities that sprawled across the land like living things, growing and changing and never quite staying still. The humans had only developed faster than light travel 80 years ago, but they had been building civilizations on this world for thousands of years before. That Thessaly could see the weight of that history in everything from the ancient buildings that stood beside gleaming towers to the languages that changed from one city to the next. She had arrived in a city called Lagos, which sat on the coast of a continent called Africa, and which held more people than some entire Consilium worlds. The streets were packed with millions of humans who had come to witness the memorial procession, and to honor the dead. Thessaly walked among them, feeling very small and very alien in the sea of humanity. But no one looked at her with hostility or fear. Instead, they smiled and nodded and made space for her to pass, and some of them even reached out to touch her arm in greeting. She found Myra Chun waiting for her near the memorial plaza. The young human had recovered fully from her ordeal, and she looked nothing like the pale and starving survivor they had pulled from that cargo pod 3 months ago. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face, and her eyes were bright with life, and she wore a uniform that Thessaly did not recognize. "Commander," Myra said warmly as she clasped Thessaly's hands in the human gesture of greeting. "I am so glad you could come. I would not have missed this," Thessaly replied honestly. though I confess I do not fully understand what is happening. Myra smiled and gestured toward the plaza where a massive crowd was gathering. We are bringing them home, she said. All of them. The procession began as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. Vehicles moved slowly through the streets, carrying the recovered remains of the dead, and each vehicle was accompanied by honor guards who walked beside. It was solemn dignity, but it was not just humans who were being honored. There were remains from 11 different species among the dead, and each one was being treated with the same reverence and care. Valorian families stood in the crowd weeping. As the vehicle carrying their long-lost relatives passed by, a delegation from the Then collective chanted mourning songs in their own language as their dead were carried past. Species that had lost people to the Kreth decades ago and had long given up hope of ever seeing them again were finally receiving closure. Thessaly watched with tears forming in her eyes as the procession continued for hours. Why? She asked Myra, who stood beside her. Why did you do all this for strangers? Myra looked at her with those strange, soft human eyes that could hold so much emotion. You saved my life, she said. One person alone in the dark 11 days from death, and your scanners almost missed me, but you looked anyway. She paused and watched as another vehicle passed carrying more of the recovered dead. You showed us what we already believed. She continued, that every single life matters and that no one should be left behind, and that sometimes one person taking the time to look can make all the difference in the universe. She turned back to Thessaly. You saved one human, she said. So we went back for everyone. The ceremony continued into the evening as the dead were laid to rest in a memorial that had been built to honor all the victims of the Kreth regardless of species. Speakers from a dozen worlds gave eulogies and shared memories and promised that the sacrifices of the dead would not be forgotten. Admiral Conko spoke last, and her words were broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. Today we honor those we lost, she said. But today is also about what we have found, and what we have found is that the galaxy is not as cold and dark as we sometimes believe. She paused and looked out at the crowd where humans and aliens stood together in shared grief and shared hope. A Valorian commander saved one human life because she could not bear to pass by a survivor in need. Okonkwo continued. That one act of compassion set in motion everything that followed, and it reminded us that kindness matters and that every life has value, and that the universe is made better when we take care of each other. She straightened. Her shoulders and her voice grew stronger. We have created a new initiative called the Recovery Directorate, she announced. Its mission is to investigate cold cases across the Consilium and to find every missing person and to recover every forgotten victim. She looked directly at Commander Thessaly, where she stood in the crowd. And we have invited our Valorian friends to join us in this work, she said, because they showed us the way. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Thessaly felt hands patting her back and voices thanking her in languages she did not understand. Later that night, she found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the city with Myra-chan at her side. The lights of Lagos stretched to the horizon like a galaxy of stars brought down to Earth. I still do not understand, Thessaly admitted. We only saved one person, and we were just doing our duty, and yet you sent a fleet and fought a war and changed everything. Myra smiled and looked up at the real stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. That is the thing about humans, Commander, she said. When someone shows us kindness, we do not forget it, and when someone saves one of us, we feel like they have saved all of us. She turned to face Thessaly with fierce pride burning in her eyes. You looked for survivors when you had no reason to believe there were any, she said. You pulled me from that cargo pod, and you treated me with dignity, and you honored my request to contact Earth, even though you did not understand why it mattered. She placed her hand over her heart. You saved one human, she said. And because you did, we went back for everyone, because that is who we are, and that is who we choose to be. Thessaly felt something shift inside her as she finally understood what she had witnessed. The humans were not just aggressive or emotional, or unpredictable. They were loyal beyond reason and compassionate beyond measure, and they would move heaven and earth for anyone who showed them kindness. She looked up at the stars and saw them differently. Now out there in the darkness, there were still people who were lost and forgotten and waiting for someone to find them. And now there was a fleet that would never stop looking. I would like to join your recovery directorate, Thessaly said quietly. If you will have me. Mira-chan smiled and clasped her hands once more. Welcome to the family, Commander, she said. We have a lot of work to do. Above them, the stars continued to shine, and somewhere out in the vast darkness, human ships were already searching for the next lost soul to bring home, because that was who they were, and that was who they would always be, the ones who never left anyone behind.